Hey guys, it's Sauce123 back for my fourth, maybe fifth video. We'll see when this gets put out. As you can probably see from your screen, this is going to be a whole new series. So far, I've been doing play reviews. There's going to be a sort of theory video with some sort of practice. I'm going to walk through the actual solution of things too. And those are going to be toy games. And toy games, well, we'll get to that in a second, exactly what they are. But this is sort of an arm of GTO poker play and one that I found important in improving my game. And sort of the grand plan of this series is going to be to start really simply with the basics and some definitions and get all of us very firmly on the same page with the basics. And then from there, we'll work up and start solving some games of increasing complexity. And I'll try to explain also how those games apply to No Limit Hold'em and how I've utilized them to improve my game. So without further ado, I'm going to get into the presentation. So this is the plan for today. First, I'm going to give a minimal definition of GTO poker, by which I mean I'm not going to set up axioms or something and solve it in a rigorous or formal way. I'm actually not going to spend a ton of time providing background and examples and really fleshing out a definition, and I'm not going to really tell you that much terminology. I think a lot of people get hung up on parts and some of the basics of GTO because there's a lot of information that you have to assimilate pretty quickly, especially people like me who don't have a math background. So what I'm going to do is try to give you the essence of GTO poker play in a quick definition, go through that definition so that we really understand what every word means. And I will just sort of repeat things so that everyone watching should be extremely comfortable with this as we move forward. I think that will sort of forestall a lot of misunderstandings that I've seen on the forums. So specifically, I'm thinking of a thread in SSNL on Run It Once, where I believe the thread title was Common Misconceptions About Game Theory Optimal Play or something like that. And in that thread, there were all these different things being conflated, and there was a lot of disorganization in how people were presenting their conceptions of GTO play and their material and stuff. So I want to sort of present GTO in a way that's simple, everyone can sort of hold in their head, and that we can work with together moving forward. That's the first step. The second step is I'm going to explain what toy games are and why they're important for solving real poker. Next, we're going to solve an extremely simple toy game, which I mean basically is a case study of how to use the terminology and how to use the definitions that we've built up so far. So I don't want there to be any mental energy or very little mental energy spent on the solution to this toy game. I think that should be easy. So instead, I just want people to figure out how the theory connects to the practice, and that'll sort of hopefully make things more clear moving forward. And then finally, I'm just going to look at the solution to this first toy game, sort of tie it to real poker, and sort of sketch out how solutions to toy games can be applied to solutions to parts of poker. Because that's sort of a interesting interpretive or theoretical exercise, and it's one that can get glossed over sometimes. People just say, oh, here's the solution to this game. And they sort of assume that you see how it's applied to poker. But actually applying the solutions to a toy game to some aspect of poker is non-trivial and very difficult. And most of the misunderstandings, I would say, not all, but a lot of the misunderstandings that happen on the forums and in videos come from that interpretive process. So we're just going to introduce that, and there'll be a lot more interpretation stuff later, and I think that's probably what I can bring to the table in a better way than others can. Certainly I'm not the most mathematically rigorous or the best math guy on these forums, or certainly in poker, I'm not even one of the best. I'm okay. I consider myself sort of a beginner with these things insofar if I was in a math class or something. I certainly don't have the skills to do things really formally. But what I think I am good at is figuring out how these solutions can be applied to poker and how they shouldn't be applied, because I have this really strong understanding of what strong poker play looks like. And that sort of helps me pick out mistakes in that interpretive process. So, first slide, or the first substantive slide. What in the heck is GTO? This is a question that gets asked all the time on the forums. And it's shocking to me that it gets asked continuously because it's very, very simple. So the only terminology that I'm going to introduce today so far, at least for most of the video, is these two concepts you see below here, GTO and Nash equilibrium. So GTO, as I'm sure pretty much all of you know, is game theory optimal poker. Gets thrown around the forums a lot. I'm playing GTO. This is my GTO strategy. This is that. This is that. Actually, when people say these things in the forums, they're usually conceptually confused and they don't really know what they're talking about in a really robust way. But I think that'll sort of fall out of what we're doing later, so I don't want to talk about that yet. GTO is typically connected to the concept of the Nash equilibrium, which just means that all the players are playing GTO. So if we're playing heads-up poker, one guy can be playing GTO poker while the other guy's doing something that isn't GTO. And we're at Nash when both guys are playing GTO. Pretty simple, I would say. Next. This is the bare bones of GTO and of Nash equilibrium. And I think what's interesting is that this is a very complicated concept, or one which seems very complicated, but I can actually define it in a sentence. And the sentence is, conceptually clear. That is, the sentence and the math don't say different things. The math is, more precise. It's a more formal way of putting things, but there's no interpretive issue here, certainly. So these are the bare bones of GTOs. We're at a Nash equilibrium if, and I have this italicized because I don't want anyone to forget this. It's going to be on every slide. We're at Nash equilibrium if neither player can unilaterally increase the expectation of their strategy. So if anyone can unilaterally increase their EV, then we're not at Nash. I think that's very obvious. So there's one distinction that I want to bring up here that gets missed in a lot of discussions of Nash equilibrium. I think once you have this distinction in mind, things will be clearer on the forums from here on out, or just your own thinking will be clearer. I know that mine is clearer for it. And the distinction just is the distinction between what a thing is versus how do I solve that thing. I don't know why I wrote this is the thing below that with an exclamation point. I assume there's some thought I had that is eluding me right now. But anyway, so this definition here just tells you what a Nash equilibrium is, and that's the thing that we're trying to find when we study, game theory optimal poker. And it's very simple what it is. We can define it very easily without actually being able to point at a single Nash equilibrium. This is the essence of the distinction. So we don't need to be able to find the Nash equilibrium for poker to know what one is. Just the sentence already tells us what it is. And we can picture, a solution to poker that would follow that condition. It's very easy to think of a situation where neither player can play a hand differently to increase their respective values. So if you want to just take a moment and think about that, I think the distinction will be very clear. Most of the confusion that we get when we talk about GTO play comes from sort of conflating the definition of the thing, what the thing is, with how do I solve that thing. Conflating it with how do I get to a Nash equilibrium. So they'll say there's no equilibrium for this game. But of course there is an equilibrium. There's an equilibrium for every game. That's just technically true. What they're actually saying is, I don't know how to get that equilibrium. Or it's beyond our current computing power to get that equilibrium. Or, some other thing. So what I want to do next is look at what's going on inside this definition. So sometimes we get, especially when this is such a powerful concept that I want to sort of build our whole understanding of GTO on, I want to spend some time going through every part of this definition and just sort of explaining exactly what we mean by all of the words being used there. Because that's really the second way, one of the main ways that confusion can creep in. So, we can be using the same words, but be talking about different things. And so I want to forestall that and sort of fix all of these words in people's minds in the way that they should be used properly in this context. And I think that will make the discussion clear. By the way, if you haven't realized it yet, for anyone watching, if you are already very familiar with optimal play and or have a math background, you can pretty much skip this video and tune in next time. So without further ado, a strategy is a set of actions for every node of the game tree. Okay, that's a useful definition, but it also invokes a bunch of other concepts that we might not know. So I think it's easier to explain, you can see neither player can unilaterally increase the expectation of their strategy, with strategy being highlighted. So certainly we're talking about strategies here. So in poker, a strategy is how you'll play every hand in every situation. And you might say, well, I don't know how I play every hand in every situation. And that's true. But once you're in the situation, you have to make a decision. And so this is what you might call a functional definition of your strategy, insofar as If you get in a situation where you have ace king on the river and the board is ace 9 8 3 2, maybe you bet 75% of the time and check 25% of the time, but you don't really know which percentage you bet, which percentage you check. So you might say, I don't even know my own strategy, really. That's fine, but this would just be defined as what you would actually do if you found yourself in that spot an infinite number of times. So it sort of abstracts from the uncertainty in your own thinking process and just gets the average of the things you'll do. And you don't have to know how you play the whole game tree before you start to play the hand. It's just if you somehow got in a situation, you would make a decision, and that's what your strategy reflects. So, say we're on the button at a heads-up game of No Limit Hold'em. Our strategy then is how we'll play every starting hand, so anything from 7 deuce to ace ace. And for our strategy to be complete, we have to explain how we play that on every possible line of bets and bet sizes on every flop, turn, and river. So, for example, we have to say what we do if we min-raised 7 deuce and got called, and the flop was ace king 4. And we also have to explain what we do if we 3x 7 deuce and got 3-bet. And we also have to explain what would happen if we limped it, etc., etc. And we have to explain, say, what we would do if our c-bet got check min-raised versus if it got check 0.25x, etc., etc., etc. And then every other line that depends on those initial lines. So what that should tell you is that strategies are big. The number of possible strategies, the number of nodes are just a piece of every possible strategy. So, for example, I raise ace king to 3x, the big blind calls, and the flop comes to ace king 4. A node of that strategy would be, how often I would bet the flop for 4 big blinds versus a check with ace king. That would be like one node. It's in, the smallest possible portion of a strategy, I suppose. It's the atom, the atomic piece of a strategy, I suppose. That would be maybe a helpful definition. And the game tree, again, is the same thing as a strategy. So it's just everything you do with every hand. Sometimes we trim the game tree to make our strategy simpler. We'll get to that later. So yeah, strategies are huge. And you don't have your whole strategy in your head at once. You have probably some principles that will help you generate a strategy. In contrast, for example, bots have their entire strategy written down. So, say we're a poker bot, and not every poker bot, but most. Most GTO poker bots, when they say get to the flop and the flop comes down ace king 8, they just look down a giant table and they say, okay, well, I have ace queen, and when I have ace queen in the situation, I bet this much. They don't actually think about or run an algorithm for the decision in the moment. They're using stored memory as opposed to RAM. Okay. Now that we know what a strategy is, we're going to highlight another part of the definition, which is this part. Neither player can unilaterally increase the expectation of their strategy. So when we say neither player, we're making an expression that refers to, both players. In this case, when we say neither player, it suggests 2 players. So in fact, we have Nash equilibria for an n-player game, where n can be, I think, some finite but large number of players. I'm not exactly sure. But anyway, a large number. And so when we're saying now this is for the 2-person game, which is generally the one that we're going to look at the most in these videos. So neither player. So this is a property that applies to both players. So equilibria, involve the strategies of 2 players. We can also have someone playing an optimal strategy, which is half of an equilibrium. So that's sort of, I like to talk about the equilibrium, the Nash equilibrium, which is the 2-player set, because the optimal strategy is sort of derivative of that, or the other way around. You can find them either way. So neither player can unilaterally increase the expectation of the strategy. So to unilaterally increase EV, in this case expectation, that just means EV. So you can just substitute those things. Remember, it's easier for you. I know we're very familiar with EV. Is to be able to increase our EV against an opponent who doesn't adjust. No matter what we do, they play the same strat. So this is a little bit tricky. Logically, I guess, it seems simple. Neither player can unilaterally increase the EV. Okay, great. So what does that mean? It means that my opponent is playing strategy X. There's no strategy Y that I can change to that will increase my EV over the strategy that I'm currently playing. But then that expression gets more complicated when we say neither player can unilaterally increase the strategy, because that means that we have a property of both players. So for example, say I'm playing an optimal strategy X. But against my optimal strategy, there's a bunch of strategies which have the same expected value. Call them, Y, Z, and Q. And say the equilibrium strategy is Z. But my opponent can not decrease his EV by changing from Z to Q. But if he does that, then I can in turn counter-exploit him by playing a strategy which might dominate Q. So in that case, it wouldn't satisfy the definition. And this is, I think, fairly obvious. Certainly any player can unilaterally decrease the EV of their strategy. Okay, moving on. What they're trying to increase is the expectation of their strategies. So what we're interested in are strategy expectations, EVs. So, for example, say my strategy involves how I play two hands. Say it's ace-ace and deuce-deuce. And there's some way that I can... Well, I mean, there's all these other issues that will sort of complicate things, but I don't want to get into them yet. So, say my opponent is playing some strategy X, and in this case, X has to be a non-optimal strategy. That's sort of irrelevant. Maybe I can change two parameters. Like maybe I can change how I play, both aces and deuces to increase the EV of my deuces somehow. That still won't follow because we're looking at the expectation of entire strategies as opposed to individual pieces of the strategy. This is really wild. Right. So in this case, I can change my strategy as much as I want at Nash equilibrium as long as my changes yield me the same EV and my changes don't allow my opponent to counter me. So for example, if limping 100% and raising 100% have the same EV against my opponent's best counter strategy, and neither allows my opponent to adjust to make more EV, then they're both parts of different Nash equilibria. So, I mean, it's conceptually possible that, limping 100% and raising 100% could have the same EV as long as they were balanced correctly, so long as the other parts of the strategy were balanced along with them. Okay, recap. By now, we should know what a Nash equilibrium is, and sometimes we talk about one player's portion of a Nash equilibrium. So, for example, not often, I would say always, our opponents are not playing a Nash equilibrium or an optimal strategy. And so I'm trying to simplify this discussion by not bringing in other concepts as much. But if one player is playing optimally, we have the highest expectation, or at least tied with the average expectation, by playing optimally ourselves. But since when we're playing actual poker, no one will ever be playing Nash equilibrium. We're always going to do the best playing a maximally exploitative strategy, which means one that counters theirs perfectly. But then we might say, well, even if my opponent's playing exploitably, I'm still going to play what my best guess at the GTO strategy is. And that would be one player's portion of a Nash equilibrium because the other player, can be doing anything. We're not even discussing it. And that's what an optimal strategy is. It says, regardless of what the other guy's doing, I'm going to try to play at equilibrium. And that's typically what we mean by a GTO strategy. You'll notice, when we're in the forums, when we're saying, I'm trying to this is my GTO strategy for this spot. That doesn't mean that we're making any assertion about how our opponent's playing. We don't think that he's, trying to play optimally as well. He might or he might not be. And even if he's trying to be, he won't actually be playing optimally. It just means that, we're playing as if he was playing optimally. We're trying to play a defensive strategy that counters whatever he could be exploiting us with. Finally, all of the major poker games, except for Chinese variants, I think, are much too big to solve to Nash equilibrium at present. So Chinese is easier because there's no betting, and so the game tree gets trimmed quite a bit. But even Limit Hold'em, which is the simplest, widely spread poker game, I actually don't know, maybe 5-card stud is similar, but sort of with the main games, Heads Up Limit Hold'em is the simplest. And that's still, too big to solve to Nash equilibrium, although the best limit bots play extremely well, and they get close in EV to the Nash equilibrium, but they never actually get there. And for further reading, I found especially helpful The Mathematics of Poker by Bill Chen and Jared Ankerman, which we'll talk about continuously, and The Intelligent Poker Player by Philip Newall. He just puts concepts very clearly and methodically, and I think will help people who don't want to, people who feel allergic to equations. He will help those people get a feel for for optimal play. Okay, so just to recap one more time. We're at equilibrium when neither player can unilaterally increase their EV, where EV equals expectation. And so, as we've already said, we can't get very close to solving huge full-scale poker games like no limit hold'em or even heads-up limit hold'em. And certainly we can't, just on pen and paper. We need huge computers and months and gathering tons of data and sophisticated algorithms and things. So it's easy to confuse ourselves when we're like, oh, I'm going to take a guess at the GTO strategy for no limit hold'em. So instead, the other approach that we can take is we can solve toy games, which are simplified games that we actually can solve. And then the second part of this first sentence here, simpler games which probably share important similarities with real poker. That's a tricky sentence. It's like, how are we going to cash this out? Like, how are we going to explain which similarities are important? How complex does the game have to be to get similar to real poker? What sort of similarities are we talking about? And I think that's something that we'll get a better idea of later on. And that's what toy games are. By far, the most discussion of toy games is The Mathematics of Poker by Bill Chen and Jared Ankenman. And the games that I'm going to start with in this series are all going to be games taken from Mathematics of Poker, so I'll cite that book repeatedly. So if you want to look at the formal discussion of the games, check out the book. And, even if you don't, you should definitely buy it. It's by far the best poker book I've ever read. And then going back to that point about what makes a toy game importantly similar with real poker, it seems like some toy games are definitely better than others, regardless of their complexity. So, like, for example, does RPS, rock, paper, scissors, tell us much about poker? It doesn't seem like it. It doesn't seem like there's much way to take that information and be a better poker player, maybe aside from the method that we use to solve it. And so certainly a blank that we're going to have to fill in is, how do we find importantly similar games? Okay. So the next thing we're going to look at is, a methodology. So that's the distinction that I was pointing to earlier in the video when I was saying the what it is versus how do we do it distinction. So methodology, we already know what a Nash equilibrium is. Now we're going to try to find the actual Nash equilibrium of, some simple toy games. So this is the how do we do it part. So, just before I explain how we're actually going to do it, I think it's kind of easy to figure out that, just conceptually speaking, ways that we could solve the game. So conceptually, brute force works fine. For example, it's true that any game, well, at least any solvable game, has a finite number of nodes, has a finite game tree. And brute force just means that, we just try every single possible strategy against every other possible strategy, and then just scan through the result and just find the ones with the highest values. Why won't that work? The reason is just because, for complex games like poker or chess or anything like that, the game trees are just way too big. It would take beyond the length of the universe to be able to find them. There's some, I didn't cite it for this, but there's an interesting description of chess, which is that the size of the nodes in the game tree, or the size of possible chess strategies, it's like bigger than the amount of atoms in the universe or something. And there's just tons of these things. So we have to weed out lots of dominated strategies before we can even start the project. So the second way is the way that they take in Mathematics of Poker, which is this process of parameterization and solving a game. You can see that method laid out in chapter 10 first, and then it's executed across all the subsequent chapters. And that's a great way to do it if you have a strong math background. I don't. And I wanted to sort of see how to solve the games myself. I wanted to sort of get my hands in there and see how these things worked and combine pieces and things. And I found that I was going to have to learn a lot of math in order to be able to do that in the same way that Mathematics Poker guys did, even though I could kind of understand what they were talking about. So I decided to take a different approach and use software. So software can be a conceptual or a computational aid. Certainly like a calculator is one thing we might want to use, but we can use a lot more sophisticated tools than that. So it turns out that we can replicate the properties which are important to most of the toy games in Mathematics of Poker in Cardrunner's EV, which is just a program which simulates the game trees for no limit hold'em and limit hold'em. And once we do that, we can use a lot of utilities in Cardrunner's EV. So for example, we get to these later on in the video. But there's utilities like EV run. So we have some game tree that we've set up. We say EV run just tells us the EV of every single hand and every single player's strategy at all the different decision points that they have. And when we do that, we can see, oh yeah, well, if I play this hand like this, or if I play it like that, I can increase my EV. And then you're like, oh, so I can unilaterally increase my EV, so that's not right. And so there's all these. Another thing that you can do in Card Runners EV is use a maximally exploitative strategy utility. So if I have a strategy for player A, I can say maximally exploitative strategy for player B, and it will just tell player B how to play every hand for its highest expectation against A. Now that doesn't get us to an equilibrium because A might be able to counter-exploit B's strategy, in which case we're not at equilibrium. But it's a good way to get started. And so using these sort of utilities and looking at EVs, are things we can kind of like guess and check, almost like first grade math. And we can see where the EVs are off in the strategies, what needs to be changed, and then that can sort of let us hone in on what optimal play is. And then also there's some sort of like algorithmic things you can do in Card Runners EV, like we can graph things and then find the node on the graph with the highest EV. And that will sort of tell us, along with our conceptual scheme, where we have to be going. This will all become clearer once we start actually doing it. So I know as poker players, we like to like see how it's done as opposed to sort of hear a description of it. So I'm going to get as quickly as possible into like actually solving things. Okay, so this is going to be our first toy game. It's extremely simple. We're going to do a slightly more complicated version of this game in the next video, and then maybe some even more complicated ones. I say even more when they're actually still all going to be pretty simple to start. But you can see this game in Chen and Ankerman's treatment in Mathematics of Poker, Chapter 11, pages 111 to 113. And all the games that we're going to be doing are going to be two-player games. This is no exception. So one thing that we're doing when we're defining our strategy is we want to say, who's doing what and who's doing the other thing. Chen and Ankerman use X and Y. I find that a little bit confusing just because X and Y are variables, and there's a distinguishing factor about the two players that we can use to differentiate them. So instead I just say IP is one player, and he'll be the in-position player, and OOP is the out-of-position player. In this game, the half-street nuts or air game, out-of-position always checks and always calls any bet. And just by convention, I think this is a little bit different than the mathematics poker treatment, but it's all very similar. The pot is one, and in-position can bet one or he can check. So at the outset, I want people to notice that out-of-position has no strategic options, or strategic options meaning that every single time, no matter what hand he is forced to check, and he's forced to call. He can never take any different actions than the ones he does take, so I think it should follow. There's no way that he can ever unilaterally increase or decrease his strategy. He can increase or decrease his strategy based on the actions of in-position, but by himself he can't. And there's going to be one street and no draws. And furthermore, out-of-position will always hold a bluff catcher, and in-position holds half nuts and half air. So, to flesh this out a little bit, when out-of-position checks and if in-position bets the nuts, out-of-position has to call, and he'll always lose. When he checks, if in-position bets air, he has to call, and he'll always win. Okay, so now we want to think about transposing this conceptual framework to Card Runners EV. So in Card Runners EV, it's going to be a two-player game. Okay, so we need to input two players. That game tree will only contain the small blind and big blind. So small blind will equal IP, big blind equals out of position, because that just follows the way that Card Runners EV represents position in the same way that it is the poker table. So for those of you not familiar with Card Runners EV, this will become very clear once we actually bring the software up. But the game tree for the big blind will only contain a check first in. And facing a bet, the tree will only contain a call for all of his hands, which is another slightly more technical way of saying he has the strategic options. And the pot is one, and in position can bet one or check. So in position's game tree will contain two strategic options. Once out of position is forced to check, he can either bet the pot or he can check behind. He can also choose a hand range for each action, which is really what it means to have strategic options. If you had to play all hands to a certain line or not, that wouldn't really be an option. And there's going to be one street and no draws. So in Card Runners EV, the game starts on the river. On the river, there's one street, there's a round of betting and then a showdown, and nobody has draws. I mean, they might have draws in the previous streets, but by the time we see the river, they're not draws anymore, they're just hands. It is satisfied the condition that out of position always holds the bluff catcher and in position holds half nuts, half air. We'll have a deuce-deuce 3-4 board, and out of position's hand range will be king-king. In positions will be half 5-5 and half ace-ace. So as you can see, that satisfies our definition because king-king beats 5-5 and it loses to ace-ace. Very simple. And here we go. This is certainly the fun part. Okay, so now we're looking at, this is the Cardinals EV. Use the beta. The beta is more powerful and just has a better interface than the alpha, or than the, not alpha, than the, I guess, finished version. I don't know what the word for that is. So when we're doing this, table size means how many players will there be, heads up. We only want the small blind and the big blind. You can see here it shows how many players there would be. We want it to be heads up. We're going to start the tree on the river, since all we need to do is show hand ranges for pre-flop, and then we only want to solve for the river. Then we can look at the blinds in the rake. I just set mine to have a 50-cent small blind and $1 big blind just to make math easier. And because the pot was 1 on the river in our example, in this toy game, we can add 1 chip to the pot, which will just simulate, well, it doesn't simulate anything in this context, but it might simulate something if you're talking about no limit hold'em. We'll set stacks. Okay, each player can only bet 1 or call 1. And then we can just start the tree. So the next thing we'll do is input this board. Deuce, 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 flop. 3 turn. River 4. And then we'll give in position 2 hands. 5-5 and ace-ace. And note that these will be, equally frequent because they're both pocket pairs. And there's one of one and one of the other. For the big blind, we'll give him kings, which of course beats 5-5, loses to aces. Big blind has to always check. So we can hover over the big blind and say, he can either fold, check, or bet. In this case, we're going to make him always check with all hands. Small blind can bet the pot or check behind. We're going to manipulate what hands he wants to bet with and what hands he wants to check with. And big blind can call or fold. Okay. Or sorry, he can't fold. Big blind calls. So before we do anything, I think we can just see what the solution should be. It should be very easy. So since the big blind is always calling, bluffs aren't going to make any money. They're just going to lose every time. So anytime we bet a bluff, we lose more than if we had checked behind. Similarly, ace-ace beats every single hand in the big blind's range, so it's a very obvious value bet. And since we can only value bet 1 or check, we always want to value bet 1. Okay, that's the solution. Similarly, since we decided that since adaptation doesn't have any strategic options, we don't need to balance anything really. We just bet our good hand since he's always going to call. We check our bad hands. Okay, easy peasy. Now, I'm just going to show how we could arrive at this same conclusion using sort of the conceptual framework we just developed and using Cardinals EV, the tools in Cardinals EV. So here we'll take both of our hand classes. Here I can input a specific hand. So in this case, I'll say ace-ace. I'll add another hand. This will be 5-5. Save and close. And then big blind must always call. And then what I just do here is an EV run. Actually, we want to compare this. We want to compare this for betting and for checking. So we take the EV run. So what this just does is we'll calculate the EV of all decisions. And so what we can do here is we can just say, okay, we want to bet at 50%. We want to check at 50%. And then we can just look at the EVs of both actions and see which one does better. Okay, so here we go. And we can hover over this. The EV of betting is 2. I think this is very obvious. Since the pot's 1, we bet 1, we always get called. So we win 2. We win the pot, we win our opponent's bet. We look here, the EV is -1. We bet, we always get called, and so we always just lose what we bet. Then we can compare that to checking. Okay, ace-ace, 1, we win the whole pot. 5-5, 0, we never win. Okay, so what happens here? Well, it's clear that we can't be at equilibrium, because one of the players can increase their expectation unilaterally, and that player is the small blind. And to do that, we want to play every hand to the line which makes the most money. So what we do instead is we say, okay, well, we compare. We say, okay, that was 1, that was 2. Okay, so we're going to play this 100%. And we go, okay, well, this was -1 and that was 0, so that's a lot better. So we just delete this one. And then we just go, okay, EV run. And then here our EV is 1, which is the entire pot, which is and then we can check this if we want using this maximally exploitative play tool. We just check that out for the small blind. This will maximally exploit the big blind strategy, meaning that we'll play every hand for its highest EV. Here we go, and lo and behold, it gives us the same result. Now the question is, if we're at equilibrium, then that means that the big blind cannot counter-exploit us in any way to decrease our EV. However, since he lacks strategic options, there's nothing he can do, which means that whatever this is the equilibrium for this very, very simple game. There we go. That's it. That's our first toy game. Solution: in position bets ace-ace. Solution: in position bets ace-ace. So again, checking this against our definition, neither player can unilaterally increase the expectation of their strategy. Since out of position has no strategic options, meaning he can only check and call with all hands, then it's analytically true, meaning it's true just from that definition. We don't have to look at anything. That he can never unilaterally increase or decrease his EV, since in position can choose which hand's the pot, and if in position makes a mistake, say in position ever bets deuces, then yeah, it's true that out of position's EV increases. But out of position didn't do that himself. In position had to make a mistake for him to increase his EV. And then we can see that for in position, his EV is maximized here. So for ace-ace, betting is greater than checking, where the greater than just means has greater EV than, and for deuce-deuce, checking is less than betting. And since out of position strategy is fixed, that's all we need to know. We just need to know how in position best plays. So in position cannot unilaterally increase his EV by playing anything differently. Therefore, we're at Nash equilibrium. Done. So, what does this mean? Not much, it's trivial. So really, this is just meant as a sort of conceptual exercise to see, how to put things into card owner's EV, how we might solve a hand using card owner's EV, get the definitions on the table, and start us off. One thing interesting that it does show is the equivalence of exploitive and GTO thinking in certain cases. So for example, if one player won't or can't adjust, then the Nash equilibrium is the maximally exploitative strategy. So because the big blind's game tree didn't contain, a folding option for king-king, no matter, in position didn't have to bluff with any frequency in order to balance his value hands. He would just only value bet. And that's the same thing as what we would, automatically realize the solution was, using our poker brains, using our exploitative thinking. It's just like, oh yeah, he's calling every time, I just bet for value. So again, this is a conceptual exercise to get people to start thinking in a new way. And then after this, we're going to get into some more interesting toy games that are going to have actual, effects for real poker. And it's going to sort of, we learn these formulas sometimes when people are talking about GTO and say, oh yeah, that's GTO. And really what they're doing is they're talking about solutions to toy games and applying them to limit hold'em or no limit hold'em or PLO. And we're going to look at those games in the subsequent episodes and go through the ones that we're not going to go through every game in Mathematics of Poker. We're going to go through a few that I find particularly important. And I'm going to try to explain how they apply no limit hold'em. So that's it. This was my first PowerPoint presentation here, so I'm still getting some of the kinks out of the show, but I hope you guys enjoyed that, and I hope for at least some of you that clarified what's meant by GTO poker. It's sort of starting from first principles in a conceptual sense, and then with a simple example. So this has been Sauce123 for RunOnOnce.com. I'll see you guys next time.